Our program this evening is on the history of the Allegheny River Boulevard. And I'm sure that everyone has sped down that road to get to Pittsburgh and sped home along the boulevard, never really paying much attention to that highway. But it does have a rich history. So tonight we're going to talk about how it evolved, how it was developed, and how it was built. At the beginning of the 20th century, Oakmont experienced a building boom. And the main reason for that was the Allegheny Valley Railroad. The railroad provided quick access to downtown Pittsburgh. So we had people come out here, and I guess you could say we were one of the early bedroom communities of Pittsburgh. Well, around 1920, we started to see a change. The main mode of transportation changed from the railroad to automobiles. So now people began to drive to Pittsburgh. The only problem was there were only two routes to get to Pittsburgh. The first route, you could cross the Halton Bridge, drive down Freeport Road. Many parts of it were unpaved. You went through Blawnox, Aspinwall, Sharpsburg, Etna. Then you cut back across through Lawrenceville, the Strip District, and you were down to Pittsburgh. Or you could go out through Penn Hills, Verona Road, through Rosedale, Sandy Creek, up the hill, on to Frankstown, down through Homewood, East Liberty, Garfield, down to the Strip, and back to Pittsburgh. So it wasn't easy to get to Pittsburgh by way of car. Well, there were a group of people here in Oakmont, and they formed the Riverside Drive Committee. And the goal of the committee was to get Allegheny County to build a roadway along the riverbank that would provide easy access to Oakmont and Verona. So they started the group. After it got going, the other communities in the valley, New Kensington, Cheswick, Springdale, Harmer, started to realize this was a good idea. So they jumped on board. And the county commissioners agreed to meet with the group to talk about planning a highway. After their meeting, and because of their efforts, the county was considering building a highway that would extend from Washington Boulevard out to Verona. However, the first version was much different than what we have today. The first version went from Verona to Nadine. You all know where Nadine is, where the pumping station was. Verona to Nadine. At Nadine, it would turn up the hill, follow Nadine Road to the top of the hill, link on to Lincoln Avenue, and proceed down through East Liberty. And the reason for that was they said the land between Nadine Road and Washington Boulevard was too unstable. There were tall cliffs, and they couldn't really build a road there. So that was the first plan for the road along the river. So the county, they were impressed. And they said, yes, you probably do need a road. And they agreed to build the road with one condition. And that was that county voters approve a bond issue to finance the project. So at that point, you had the Riverside Drive Committee change their focus from trying to get the road built to getting this referendum passed. So they ran ads like this in newspapers in Pittsburgh and eastern suburbs. And on May 26, 1928, it was approved. So they received the funding. Now, in addition to the Riverside Drive, they also included Sawmill Run Boulevard, Ohio River Boulevard, and Moss-Side Boulevard. So there were three projects that would be a part of this. So construction began in 1928. The 4.5-mile highway would extend from Washington Boulevard to Verona. Engineers did further study of that section between Nadine and Washington Boulevard, and they determined they could build the road. But what they would do, they would include a tunnel. It was a 1,400-foot tunnel under the cliff down near the intersection with Washington Avenue. So the first plans called for that tunnel to be down at the end of the roadway there. The road would include 3 bridges. There were 3 small creeks that they had to cross. Quigley Run, which is just below Verona. You had Sandy Creek, and then you had Shades Run. And Shades Run was located between Nadine and Washington Boulevard. Now, the bridges over Sandy Creek and Quigley Run, I don't even know where they're at. They're very small bridges, and you zip over them and don't even know. Shades Run was a problem for them because there's a little valley that runs up where the creek comes down. And the creek is very small, maybe 3 feet, 4 feet wide. But the problem was the Pennsylvania Railroad had a rail spur that ran up that valley. And it was only about 1/8 of a mile long. And I couldn't find why it was there. The only reason I could think is there might have been a drift mine up in there at one time that had serviced. So the railroad stored rail cars up there. But because it was considered an active railroad, they had to build this bridge to all kinds of specifications. It had to be a certain width, certain height, certain clearance. And as a result, we have that long bridge, and you probably noticed it when you cross over. This was probably the first blunder of the whole project because they started construction of the bridge. By the time, between the time they started and finished, the railroad and the county didn't communicate. The railroad abandoned that rail line. So this bridge was totally unnecessary. And it added $250,000 to the cost of the project, which $250,000 in 1926 was a lot of money. So that is the longest bridge, and you can tell it's not in good shape. It's probably just a matter of time before they're going to have to replace that. What they could have done, and what they've done the other ones, they could have filled it in and put a small culvert over that little creek and would have eliminated that problem. This is another picture of the road under construction. The roadbed was concrete. Now the curb was not cement or concrete like most roadways. Those curbs there are granite slabs. The entire length on both sides, they use granite slabs for the curb. So the next time you're sitting in traffic on there, look over at the curb. I mean, the road level has raised, so they're not as high, but you can see how uneven they are, and they're in sections. Again, another costly expenditure that was added to the cost of the boulevard. There was a construction company back in the 1970s. They came in and they said they would replace all the curbs with concrete curbs free of charge if they got to keep the granite. That's how valuable that granite was. So you've probably heard me refer to this as Riverside Drive. That was the name of the highway, Riverside Drive. There was a lady in Oakmont, her name was Irene Harwick. And Mrs. Harwick wrote a letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Daily Post, and she said, Riverside Drive is not a good name for that highway. And the reason is, she said, we have 3 rivers in the Pittsburgh area. If you call it Riverside Drive, it could be Ohio, Allegheny, Monongahela. She said it should be named Allegheny River Drive. That way people will know its exact location. So the county officials took her up on that, although they tweaked it a little bit, and they changed it to Allegheny River Boulevard. But had it not been for Mrs. Harwick, it probably would have been named Riverside Drive. There were 3 scenic lookouts that were along the route. This is the first one. This is coming off of Washington Boulevard. They've all since been closed and fallen into disrepair. This is in the worst shape of all 3 of them. You can see it's overgrown and the stones are starting to separate and fall apart. Here's the one between Sandy Creek and Nadine. There's been a gentleman from Penn Hills who's took it upon himself to go down there and cut the grass and plant flowers, and it really looks presentable now, and it looks a lot better than it did. And then this is the one coming out of Verona there. This is on the lower side. This is the only one that's lower. You can see the boulevards up there above it. Picture taken looking up at it. You can see on the side here, those are two staircases that come down. And you see the stonework in the middle there? That's a fountain. And all three had fountains in them. They were filled by springs. And so they had continual water that ran through those. They had picnic benches. Driving the boulevard in 1930s was an experience. And you have to stop and think. If you lived in the city of Pittsburgh, we had three rivers, but city residents really didn't have access to the rivers. They may see them when they went over a bridge, but the riverbanks were lined with steel mills, railroad tracks, so they had no access. But all they had to do was go out to Highland Park, right on the edge of the city, and drive out, and there was the valley, there was the river. And it was an experience. And you talk about Sunday drives, that's what people did. Today, we don't realize the impact of that highway. This is a picture in the summer when you drive down, you wouldn't even know there's a river there. All the foliage, the trees between the river and the highway have grown back. So in the winter, you can sort of get the effect sometimes whenever the leaves are all down. But we don't realize the impact that road had whenever it opened. So I said the bridge was one of the first blunders whenever they started construction. They started construction on the Verona end, they started construction on the Washington Boulevard end, and started coming down. There was another major problem. At Nadine, that was the Western Pennsylvania Water Authority, they never got the right-of-way to go past there. So construction halted. It was held up for almost 3 years as lawsuits were filed back and forth. Western Pennsylvania Water didn't want to give up the land. Then you can see those dotted lines. That's the route where the road was supposed to go. It crosses through utility lines, over the train tracks. They couldn't get through there. It finally took an act of the Pennsylvania legislature to give Allegheny County authority to condemn the property and that way take it over and they could build the road. The other problem they had was with the railroad. You can see how it goes over that railroad track there. The railroad had to shift the tracks closer to the river, but the problem was they couldn't get too close to the river because the bank would erode. So they had to get permission from the Army Corps of Engineers to fill in the riverbank, to expand the ground so they could shift the railroad out of the way. I thought this was funny. This was one of the ideas they had to eliminate the problem. They were going to build what they call a flyover ramp. And up in the top right, that shows the roadway was actually going to be a ramp that went up the hill, over top of the Western Pennsylvania Water building, and then down the other side. It would have been like a roller coaster. That bottom picture there, that's an artist's rendition that was superimposed on a picture, and that was in the Pittsburgh Press. And it shows that would have been the boulevard going up into the treetops to get around that building. Another problem, as I said, they were coming this way, they were coming this way. They had the road finished. And it opened on February 5th. 1934, except for that little spot there. And there was a dirt road that connected the two portions of the highway. So you could drive down and then you had to go through this little dirt to get on the other side and go. They eventually had to tear that house down, shift the tracks over, bring the road through there, and they were able to continue through there. The road finally opened on June 14th of that year, another 5 months before it was ready to go. When it did open completely, the county commissioner at the time was a man by the name of Charles McGovern. And Commissioner McGovern refused to hold a dedication ceremony, saying there's nothing to celebrate. Let's forget about it all. He said it was such a disaster from the start. He was just glad it was finished and out of the way. The final cost was $3.5 million, $1 million over budget. Now today, that would be not bad, but in 1920 dollars, that's a lot of money. And then this is another picture. I'm sure you old-timers would remember this. This is the boulevard coming into Verona. The steel factory is now where the Giant Eagle and McDonald's are. And that's how we remember it whenever we were growing up. Problem with it now, it's just been neglected. You know, it needs just cleaned up and spruced up a little bit. So at this point, we're going to talk about Allegheny River Boulevard in Verona and Oakmont. First part of the 20th century, the main business district in Verona was East Railroad Avenue, the lower street. And that's where most of the businesses were. When they built the boulevard, it connected to what they called Front Street on the southwestern edge. So they connected on to Front Street. When they did that, they changed the name of Front Street to Allegheny River Boulevard and extended it through Verona. So the road extended through Verona. Once that happened, then we started to see the businesses migrate from East Railroad up to the boulevard, and that became the main business district. Here in Oakmont, the boulevard followed what they called Oakmont Avenue. At the time, again, early 20th century, the boulevard here was known as Oakmont Avenue, and it was primarily a residential street. There were a lot of large mansions, estates along there. When they put the boulevard through, then by the 1920s, you started to see these houses, these mansions come down, and then the businesses started to move in, and it became our main business thoroughfare. You can see the trolley tracks there that ran along the boulevard here. They ran along the left side of the boulevard. This was taken right out front of the library there. That's the steps to the library. Allegheny River Boulevard was extended up through Oakmont. It ends at Halton Road. To cross over Halton Road, that's still known as Oakmont Avenue over there. That part remained Oakmont Avenue. Prior to the construction of the boulevard, Oakmont and Verona were connected by an old streetcar bridge. This bridge was shared by cars and trolleys. Now, when you're in Verona and you're coming towards Oakmont, as you go past the get-go, you come to the Cannon Monument, and there's that road that veers off to the right. That's Front Street, and that's part of the original Front Street. And that came over, and it seems like that road just goes there and stops, and then you can turn and go up. But that is the entrance to that bridge. That picture was taken right there. That building on the left is now the American Beverage Building, Daily Juice, that's down there. So the bridge went behind it, and then you can see about halfway through, it curves to the left. It came down into Oakmont on an angle, and it came in right at the present-day intersection of Plum Street and Allegheny River Boulevard. But that's how we got back and forth to Oakmont and Verona back then, until the viaduct was completed. The new viaduct was completed on June 21st, 1938. Four-lane highway, lighted, sidewalks. It connected Oakmont and Verona. They held a big dedication service that day. And what they did, they had two parades. One started in Oakmont, the other started in Verona, and they marched together until they got to the center of the viaduct, and they had a dedication ceremony there. And this is a picture of the Oakmont parade coming in. And when that was built, the railroad was still active, and you can see the big water tower that sat right there, right next to the roadway as you came into Oakmont. Now we're going to talk about the Allegheny River pylons. At the entrance to the boulevard in Verona, there's two stone pylons, and they mark the beginning of the 4.5-mile section from Verona to Washington Boulevard. Originally, there were a pair of these at the Washington Boulevard end of the road. However, they took them out when they expanded the intersection, removed them. They are 8 feet long, 10 feet high. If you look, they have sculptures on them. Those were sculpted by local Pittsburgh sculptor. His name was Frank Vittor. Mr. Vittor did the statue right here on the corner out here. That was one of his projects. He did these here. And the scenes depict local history, colonial history here in western Pennsylvania. There were originally 12 of these in the county: Sawmill Run Boulevard, Ohio River Boulevard. Out of the original 12, only 4 are left. There's 2 here in Verona and 2 at the beginning of Ohio River Boulevard over in Emsworth. The other ones were either taken out when the roadways were expanded or were damaged with automobile accidents. So those are 2 treasures that we have in our town. Back in 2008, they'd pretty much fallen into disrepair. Back in 2008, residents of Verona made it a project. They cleaned them up, landscaped them, and inside there, you may not notice it when you go by at night, they're lighted. There's lights in there. There's a lot of, exterior lights, but if you look, it says Pittsburgh, Verona, and everything, and they rewired and repaired those lights, so now they're lighted. So they are a nice landmark that we have here in Verona and Oakmont. This gives you an idea of what it looked like when it was built. This is the turnoff between Sandy Creek and Nadine. In the time since it was built, the setbacks have been forgotten. The roadway has provided the residents of the Allegheny Valley quick access, a direct route to Pittsburgh. Motorists enjoy the scenes along the river, but over the years, the trees and brush have grown to obstruct those views. Sadly, recently it's fallen into disrepair. I mean, we all know the lookouts are in disrepair. If you drive down there, there's branches and trees and litter and everything, brush, all along the length of it. And it's sad the way that it's just been neglected. In 1994, there's a group called Scenic America, and they named the Allegheny River Boulevard in one of the top 10 endangered highways in the country. And they're hoping to gain some recognition that, it could be restored. There is a group that has just been formed. It's called the Allegheny River Boulevard Preservation Group, and they're forming a committee to try to address the concerns of here. I know they had a couple of Zoom meetings just within the past couple of months, so hopefully they'll be able to, get some funding and maybe work to get it cleaned up, because it is an important highway, and it's an important part of the history of Oakmont and Verona. Thank you. It's so good to see you all. I appreciate you coming out, and we'll see you next month.